What would peace look like from the perspective of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children who have been separated from their families, transferred to Russia, Russian-occupied territories, and Belarus? This is, in fact, the largest missing children's case since World War II. It is an egregious violation of children's rights, human dignity, and international law. So how can we respond? In February, President Trump suggested that he thought he could persuade Russian President Vladimir Putin to order the release of thousands of Ukrainian children who've been forcibly transferred. And following a March 11th meeting in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Ukrainian and American delegations released a joint statement outlining important steps to restoring durable peace. Among them was the return of Ukrainian children who've been transferred to the Russian Federation as a necessary part of the peace process. And European leaders met in Kiev over the weekend to discuss the path to peace. The new Pope just yesterday called for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine and the urgent need to reunite children with their families. President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin may meet in Turkey later this week to discuss the necessary basis for diplomacy. But our conversation today will focus on what this means for the children and families who remain separated across conflict lines and the steps that must be taken to reunite them. We've brought together leaders on this issue from the Ukrainian government, from the US government, from civil society, research, and faith groups to shed light on this urgent work. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to start by turning to Daria Zarevna, who's the senior advisor to the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, and the operations director for the Bring Kids Back initiative. Daria, can you give us, please, a full picture of who's affected? Who are the children that we're talking about? Children who've been forcibly transferred, deported, adopted, militarized, and children at risk in occupied territories. This is an opportunity to clarify the numbers and the scope of the issue. Daria.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for gathering here today. Thanks a lot for organizing this very important discussion. So when we speak about the children who are affected by the Russian aggression, we do not mean only those who have been deported to the Russian Federation or to Belarus, we do not mean only those who have been forcibly transferred deeper into the temporarily occupied territories, but we also should talk and mention the children who are staying at the temporarily occupied territories and facing everyday Russification, indoctrination, and militarization. According to the data which we have managed to gather, right now we have around 20,000 documented reports about illegally deported children, and we've managed to return only 1,307 children. But when we speak about the children who are staying in the temporarily occupied territories, the number is much higher. We estimate this number as approximately 1.6 million children. Again, it's very complicated to talk about specific numbers because Russia does not provide any information. They steal children, they hide them, they hide their whereabouts, they do not provide any information neither to Ukraine nor to any international organization. They change, you know that, they change their names, their date of birth, place of birth, citizenship, and transfer them to the distant regions of Russia, mixing them all up, making it very hard and complicated to identify and find and bring them back. On the political level, Russia denies the fact that they stole these children and deported them and forcibly transferred. And on the technical level, they create the obstacles which make it extremely difficult even for the parents who want to return these children and want to reunite with them. For example, recently, the mother of 3 deported daughters was banned from entering Russian territory because she failed the so-called Russian filtration procedure. And it happens on many, many levels in many, many situations. We have lots of cases like this. So this is how it goes. Also, during the summer of 2022, the so-called Commissioner on Human Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, reported that 750,000 Ukrainian children have been accepted by Russia, but after the International Criminal Court arrest warrants, they stopped saying publicly any numbers. And for now, of course, it's extremely complicated to tell you the exact, 100% sure number of children who are staying, who were deported and who are staying in the Russian territory. Anyway, I want to return to the question of the children who are staying in the temporarily occupied territories under non-stopping Russification, because this category of children is also very, very vulnerable. Their schools now follow Russian curricula. They are punished for speaking Ukrainian. They are forbidden to call themselves Ukrainian. And they are forced to become part of Russian propagandist war machine. How it works? First, at the first step, they are taught to hide their origin. On the second stage, they are taught to feel ashamed of it. At the third stage, they are eventually taught to hate Ukraine and everything that is related to Ukraine and everything Ukrainian. And for a child who is left alone, this becomes a survival strategy, because they are surrounded by their cultural environment, by the teachers, by the propaganda, by the constant indoctrination, and they simply cannot do nothing with this. Also, I want to say a few words about the Russian constant militarization. This year, they are providing the whole Russian games, which are called Zernitsa 2.0. The whole Russian competitions among children, which are conducted by Yunarmia, the youth military organization, which is a part of Russian Ministry of Defense. And these children who are playing this Zernitsa 2.0 are trained to become drone operators or soldiers, or according to the new adapted version of these games, they are also taught to become propagandists, ideological instructors, and carriers of the war ideology. Also, starting from this year, all the 18 years old boys are subject to mandatory military service in the Russian army. Also, conscription of protected persons is clearly prohibited by international law. Russia is doing it anyway. And in a year, these boys will be on the front line in the uniform of the army, that kills their families, both on occupation and on the other side of the front line. I want to emphasize that this is an attack on Ukrainian society and on Ukrainian family, because in our country, family is a heart palm heart is an essence of the society itself. And during whole 20th century, Russia has been erasing Ukrainian identity with the help of Gulag, Holodomor, forced collectivization. They were killing our writers, poets, top thinkers, civil society representatives. And now they're doing the same, but they're going through another path. They're trying to erase our identity and destroy our future by stealing our children, by ruining and destroying Ukrainian family, which preserves all the memory of the nation and the tradition of the nation and the cultural essence of the nation. This is what they do. And this is why Russia bombs our cities with missiles and targets our families with deportations and indoctrination. So this is the tragedy of a huge scale. And this is why the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, launched the Bring Kids Back UA initiative back in 2023. You know, the key idea of the Bring Kids Back UA is that at the end of the day, it will turn from the presidential initiative, from the government activity to the movement which unites both state stakeholders, diplomats, civil society, international partners, legal enforcement, human rights defenders, lawyers, and all the people who want to contribute into this question, because it's not only about Ukrainian children, it's about the challenge which we experienced when we started to work, when we launched Bring Kids Back UA. We've realized that there is no international mechanism of returning these children. We established the task force of Bring Kids Back UA, and I want to use this opportunity to thank both to the members of this task force who are present here today, and also for Lady Baroness Helen Kennedy, who co-chairs this task force together with the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak. I want to thank for all the efforts and all the contribution, because the level of engagement of all the members of task force is unbelievable. But the thing is, there is still no legal mechanism, not legal, but no understandable and clear and specific mechanism of how to return these children back home. Yeah. And of course, we understand that we need to develop something which can be used not only now, not only during this war, but in other wars or in other situations of violations of children's rights. This is what we fight for. This is what we believe in. And also want to emphasize here that when President launched this initiative, for him, it also was very important that we are focused on returning Ukrainian children, both through mediation and through the rescue missions, through the collaboration with civil society and volunteers, but also we focus on reintegration and rehabilitation once these children are returned, because this is extremely important that when they will return, they will receive all the necessary psychological, social, legal support, and will be successfully reintegrated into the Ukrainian society. So in general, unfortunately, I will need to leave a little bit earlier. So if you don't mind, I will finish with a few thoughts on what we need to do and where we need to focus. I think that this is extremely important, especially now when the peace talks are in progress. we need to be sure that together with all our allies, we are standing on the same principal positions. These children should be returned unconditionally. They should not become bargaining chips. On the one hand, the question of illegally deported Ukrainian children should be linked to the negotiations. On the other hand, it should be depoliticized. So Russians cannot speak about exchanging children for territories or objects. This is completely inappropriate. And this is first what we need to focus on. We need to have the same joint aligned position with our allies. Second, we need to put more pressure on Russia. They are afraid of sanctions. They are afraid of diplomatic pressure. This is what we need to do. Economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, information pressure, sanctions pressure. Russia understands only the language of force. There is no point of speaking with them in a diplomatic manner. They really start to respond properly only when you show them that you are not afraid of them and that you are ready to beat them. Only in this case, they start to act properly. Next, third, we, of course, need to develop the humanitarian way of resolving this issue. In Bring It Back UA, we together with our experts, we try to check the wide range of international experience related to abduction, forced adaptation, militarization, and so on, and studied different best world practices. And of course, it's extremely important that we will develop the humanitarian instrument of giving access to these children, to the information about them, to the international organizations, to make it possible to develop the connection with these children. As an example, for example, some Central Asian countries such as Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, they managed to return some of the children who were kept in the camps in Syria. That happened because of these children were identified through DNA, and then the communication was built with their parents, with their mothers, and these children also were provided the possibility to receive the education, to study with their native language, to be sure that to reduce trauma and to make sure that their national identity will not be erased. But all these best practices or some success cases, unfortunately, they are not applicable and they do not work in our case, simply because Russia doesn't want to collaborate. They simply do not want to provide any access to information, any access to these children. And this is the key problem. And this is why I speak about pressure and that we should be united here. Sorry. Yeah.
No, it's all so important. We're going to walk through some of the best practices from other contexts a little bit later, but I also wanted to make sure that we have some time for Mykola Kuleba, who leads Save Ukraine. As Ms. Zarivna mentioned, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Mykola Kuleba leads Save Ukraine, which, as Daria mentioned, is leading some of the humanitarian rescue efforts of these children. There's a formal mediation process, and then there's also the sort of underground railroad, which Mykola and his team at Save Ukraine are leading. Mykola, a lot of the information we have about what the children are experiencing is coming from the children that you've returned. Can you tell us a little bit about what we've learned from their shared lived experience and how that's informing your efforts?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Gillian, and thank you for this opportunity. And my organization, Save Ukraine, work hard to rescue these kids from Russia captivity And to date, we have rescued 640 children, including 141 orphans and many others who were forcibly taken to Russia or held in the occupied territories. We estimate that at least 1.6 million children have lived under occupation since 2014. And you know that according to Russia officials, over 700,000 Ukrainian children have been registered in Russia after 2022 invasion. And under international law, this is not evacuation, this is forcible deportation, as you know. And Russia does not want to return children, Ukrainian children. You heard Lavrov, Putin, and many statesmen that please come and we will be welcome and give you kids, but it is a lie. Russian government provides little to no transparency about the allocation or condition. They use false narratives to justify taking them, citing evacuation, protection, or lack of guardians, but these are deliberate lies. What they are really doing is removing these children from their families, communities, and identity and binding them to Russia. Today, we are here in the United States with one of the boys we rescued and his mother, Tatiana. He was only 16 years old when he was taken directly from his home, first to a summer camp, which is re-educational camp, that turned out to be a preparatory program for a Russian naval military academy. There, he was pressured to become a soldier, trained to serve a country that was destroying his own. His identity was under threat of being erased. And you can find this story, some of this story on 60 Minutes piece and about his mother, but it was really hard for his mother to left her kids, or 6 kids, she has 7, and to go to find his kid, and it was a real tragedy. She was interrogated, humiliated, and had immense risk, and she was threatened to be jailed or prisoned to 25 years in Russia. And they sent her to lie detection, and it's really horrible. And she saved her son, and we helped her. Yeah, and that's why we are here, just to raise awareness about what Russia's doing, with massively doing. It's not about blood, or it's about tens of or thousands of children. Another 17 years old boy told us that his father was tortured to death by Russian forces after refusing forced mobilization. He was forced to dig his own grave. Imagine what it means for a child to live with that knowledge. And after his father's death, the Russians handed this boy a draft notice personally. And we now receive more and more desperate messages from 17 and 18 years old boys terrified of being conscripted into the Russian army. In fact, 80% of these boys of this age had already received draft notice. And it goes deeper. We've seen how militarized youth programs are growing, camps where children are taught to, through grenades, handle weapons, and simulate combat. Children as young as 10 are being trained for war. And yet, and in these terrible circumstances, children find the strength to resist. Some raise Ukrainian flags, others whisper Ukrainian songs, draw national symbol in notebooks. One boy told us that his classmate was deported just for taking a photo with the Ukrainian flag. Parents, fearing for their children's safety, are often forced to silence them not because they want, but because they are trying to keep them alive. And our children are really heroes. And they are waiting for us. They believe in us. They resist because they believe Ukraine will return to everyone home, every street, and every family. And we are fighting for every child, and we are rescuing them one by one. And it's hard, but that's why we are here, just to raise awareness, just to ask Americans about their support, Americans, decision makers especially, not to forget us and stand with us and continue support Ukraine, because this war about children. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mykola. Yeah, it was incredible to speak with Vlad, who Mykola mentioned, this tremendous effort to reunite him with his mom and the huge risks that his mother took. And yet there are 800 children still in the situation that he was rescued from. So that, you know, just listening to him talk about that and the weight he's carrying, concerned about the 800 other kids from Kherson that are still there, still being militarized, without relief, and the passion he's bringing to members of Congress to relay that story. It's incredible. I want to turn now to Vladislav Havrilov, who is he's a Ukrainian historian and a researcher based in Kiev, and we have the huge honor of having him on our team at the Collaborative at Georgetown from a distance. Vlad is a historian and was studying the forcible transfer of Ukrainians in previous eras. And we met in the first 6 months of the war when he noticed that our work was focusing on forcible child-family separation in a number of contexts, and said, I would like to work with you to raise attention to this issue. So he's actually been tracking from the very beginning, even starting as a volunteer, where these children have gone and how their passageways have sort of retracked the use of the Gulag system during the Soviet period. Vlad, do you want to put this in historical context for us for a few minutes?
Thank you, colleagues. Glad to see you all. Yes, what I want to mention that is a more dangerous practice, that a forcible deportation of children, it's not a new practice for Russian Federation. Yes, we know that it's planned policy created by a government, created by Russian officials, with involving in some Russian governors, presidents of Russia, commissioner of children rights. Yes, but it's not a new practice. From Soviet period, we know about several forcible deportation, including children. For example, in 1940, in 1949, it's a forcible deportation from Baltic states. And I have several meetings with my colleagues from Estonia who said me, for example, about stories of parents who are forcibly deported from Estonia only that they don't want to support Soviet regime. After that, they forcibly deported to Siberia, and their children growing up in Siberia. And very dangerous that after that, they have a problem with knowing of their own language. They have a problem to understand their identity after that. And thousands years they have no chance to come back into home, because they have a document, a special document from Soviet regime, that you have no chance to come back to home after that. And what we mentioned from this time, from modern time, that Russian officials do the same. They occupied territories, after this occupation stolen children and forcibly deported children to Russian Federation. And very difficult to find a special location where situated these children after that. And it's very dangerous because it's so difficult to find, to identify these children and to come back in these children to home. And what especially I want to add, that deportation, it's not an end of this process. After the deportation, you know about the process of forcible militarization and re-education of these children. For example, we have some interviews with my colleagues from charity foundation East Source, and one teenager from Donetsk region said to us that he is growing up 6 years under Russian occupation, and Russian officials change books, Ukrainian books, to Russian books, have a lot of militarization class, have a lot of militarization lessons for them. And what more dangerous, that they creating like a paramilitary unit in occupied territories. Our colleagues told to you earlier about Young Army, Young Guardia movement of First. It's all organization from Russia, but what is more dangerous, that this organization creating not only in Russia, and they try to erase identity in children, not only with deported children, they try to erase identity with children in occupied territories of Ukraine. And it's a thousand of children who are under this dangerous situation, you know, and a very big parallel to Soviet regime, what tried to re-educate children, re-educate Ukrainian children, re-educate children from Baltic states. Russian do the same. Right now, Russian Federation do the same policy, and so that's why it's a planned policy from Russian Federation. And I think one mechanism what we should do, it's maybe to improve some international sanctions against especially Russian officials who involved in this process, because we know about these facts that some Russian officials try to control some occupied territories, and they try to deport children in their region, because in Russia they have a big demographical problem, and they try to stolen Ukrainian children and re-educate them into Russian children. And it's a more dangerous practice, what we mentioned, and we know that they do this practice from Soviet time. So that's why it's very important to support from international society, to support from American society, especially to help us, to help Ukraine to come back these children to home, because
Yeah,
it's an important
thank-
issue.
Thank you so much, Vlad. I think the point you raise is so important because there are some people in the United States who actually do believe the Putin narrative that this is a humanitarian operation. And yet when you compare this with the Soviet legacy, we know that this is a practice. It's very intentional. So it's if you look into this just a little bit, it's very clear that this is what it is. It's not a humanitarian practice. So I want to turn now to Nathaniel Raymond, who is the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale University. And his team has been doing remarkable research that was once funded by the US government, which has now been, the funding has been cut. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later. But he's been doing tracking and documentation of the very calculated steps to move these children out of Ukraine and into Russia and into also occupied territories. Nathaniel, if you can also speak about the gap between international law, which is very clear, we know what we're supposed to do, what's supposed to happen. The gap between that, the international law that exists, and the global response mechanisms, how they're supposed to work, and reality. Thank you.
Thank you. The international law that applies here is at its core the Geneva Convention. And the Geneva Convention lays out 4 critical steps that Russia should have taken on day one, the moment these children came into its custody. The first step is to register the children through a process with the International Committee of the Red Cross, known as RFL, or Restoring Family Links. That process is the first thing that happens when an occupying power comes into custody of children during war. That it's been 3 years, that never happened. The second step is to allow the children to call home, meaning to connect with their government and with their home communities and families. Again, it's been 3 years. That step never happened. The third step is to allow international agencies, including the Red Cross and the United Nations, such as UNICEF, to access the children where they are. Again, it's been 3 years. That step never happened. And the fourth and most important step, and I really want to highlight this in the context of Russia's stated rationale for these deportations and naturalizations being humanitarian in nature, as Jillian mentioned, that for medical reasons or to remove the children from risk of harm during combat, that they had to take these children away from their home locations to Russia. Well, the Geneva Convention says explicitly that if you have the children that has come into your custody during war, they must be moved as soon as possible to a third party neutral country. And so the law is very clear. Not only is there very limited time for an emergency humanitarian evacuation under the law, it should focus on getting these children out of the custody of the occupying power. And all four of those steps did not happen. So let's flip it around. What has our research at Yale School of Public Health and the research of many of the people on this call shown? Well, what's happened is not only did they fail to do these four steps, Russia actively did the exact opposite. And so here are the four things Russia did. Russia, as we showed in our December 2024 report on coerced adoption and fostering, they made these children Russian. So they not only failed to register them, they made them Russian citizens. Second, they did not share the information with the home country, Ukraine, or the international community, but they did share information about the children through 3 interconnected databases with Russians looking to adopt or foster children. So they had the information, shared the information within Russia, but not with the people looking for the kids. The third thing they did is they actively concealed information about the children, including changing names, hiding data. And as Mikola said earlier, basically, we know they've engaged in a shell game where they're moving children from location to location and trying to evade detection of the children's names and locations. The fourth point of what Russia did, which was the exact opposite of what was required under the law, is that they have used these children as part of negotiations. And that was mentioned earlier, and it's the point I want to end on, to really give you the so what. What's the so what here if we fail as an international community to get these kids back separate from the negotiations? Well, the so what is not just about children in Ukraine, and Dasha mentioned this, and not just about the war in Ukraine right now. It's about the future of children in conflict, that normalizing trading children like they're POWs or they're spies or it's some sort of prisoner exchange between nations means that the special protected status under the Geneva Conventions that I just laid out for you in terms of the 4 points of what Russia emphasis should have done. If we allow Russia to trade these kids, what ends up happening is that we're giving the green light to state actors and non-state actors in all the conflicts of the future to say that you can use kids as poker chips in a very dangerous card game. And that means that the special protected status under Geneva for children in war is gone. Dunzo, never coming back. And so we have to act right now with immense urgency, not just because of these children, not because of their situation alone, but to protect the international regime for all children in all the wars of the future going forward. So that really needs to be the fire lit underneath our collective tukuses at this moment to get this right. Because if we don't, then we are really condemning children in the future to be ... hostages.
Thank you so much. That is absolutely clear and very compelling. Thank you for making that case. I'm going to introduce now Lauren Murray, who's the co-lead of the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action and the Task Force for Unaccompanied and Separated Children. So Lauren has worked all over the world in a variety of conflict settings, and she's not unfamiliar with forcible child family separation in other contexts. I do appreciate that you said we have learned some things from these other contexts. And if you can enter now with a ray of hope and light for this really concerning situation, what is possible?
Thanks so much, Julian. Thanks all. It's great to be here. Diving straight into a few key recommendations. I think one has to be around handover protocols. So these have been used in countries such as Chad, Mali, Niger, Somalia, Sudan, Uganda, etc. And these protocols are agreements by governments or armed groups, often supported by the United Nations, that swiftly transfer children who are allegedly associated with armed forces and armed groups to child protection actors so that they can receive appropriate support services, including reintegration assistance, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. And these have resulted in children returning home when it is in their best interest and holding various actors to account. Of course, in some contexts, these protocols may require third-party mediators who can also play a wider and pivotal role. So thinking about who is on this call today, I'll point out a few examples for where the US supported mediations and negotiations in various conflict or post-conflict situations. So for example, going way back when, former Senator John Danforth played a critical role in Sudan in the 90s, where a committee was established for the eradication of abduction of women and children. What's interesting, I think, about this committee is that it included an array of professionals, including those from the Interior Ministry, security forces, but also representatives from civil society, women's unions, and concerned tribe members, as well as actors who were engaged in the tracing efforts. And this committee oversaw the return of children and supported linkages to ongoing support. More recently, shall we say, in 2014, many will remember that 270 girls were abducted by Boko Haram from their school in northern Nigeria. The US dispatched a multidisciplinary team that included civilian and humanitarian experts. I know Qatar also playing quite a critical role now in Ukraine. And the role of these neutral international parties cannot be understated to help scale up the technical level cooperation that is needed between child protection authorities. Family tracing and interim care, which have been highlighted by some of the panel members already, are really critical first steps. And as some have already mentioned, we need to take it a step further and talk about what life looks like when a child returns and what the reintegration process actually entails. We see in contexts like Uganda that even when the guns have gone silent, there's not necessarily peace and security. In other words, the absence of war does not mean normalcy. And children don't just return to life as it was. They need to renegotiate their space in society and re-establish their identity. As outlined in the Paris Principles, reintegration goes beyond reunification and includes the needs to facilitate access to education, to psychosocial care, livelihoods, as well as provide safety and enhance community acceptance. Reintegration means that a child has a meaningful role in society and access to their rights and their dignity. And this, of course, requires broader, long-term and sustained support long after the conflict ends. This also, I think, importantly, extends beyond the child and the family. Communities themselves need to be supported. Those who were affected need to be supported and included in ongoing reintegration efforts to minimize stigma and to enhance the protective environment around the child.
Thank you. No, it's great to have points to look at. And I especially appreciate that you've kind of locked in on where the US has been helpful in the past. I remember the Boko Haram multidisciplinary team really well, and that was a great example that we have not yet seen in this response 3 years into the war in Ukraine, 3+ years. So thank you for flagging that, and we'll bring in James to talk about his efforts on the congressional side soon to see if any of that can be replicated. But then again, there's the ideal, right? There's what works, and then there's reality. And Mikola, nobody knows the reality better than you. Can you, I mean, obviously you've returned more kids than anyone at this point, more than half of those that have been returned, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to this scale. But we often say that, you know, good policy and good practice builds on what works, right? So what is working that we can build on that you've experienced?
Thank you, Gillian. Yeah, we are successful as the NGO of providing our rescue operation, or we call this like underground railroad operations. But it is a drop, really, and it's really hard to find kids, especially orphans, or kids whose parents were killed, arrested, disappeared. And it's a huge risk for anyone, even for relatives who are trying to reach a child. You could be immediately deported if for the intention of to find your kid and to take your kid back to Ukraine. You have to tell a lie. You have to tell legend that, oh, I want to stay in Russia, and you have to glorify Putin or Russia on camera because they will create a video with you, and it is Russian regime. And to be honest, I don't believe that Putin will give any kid. And you've seen Lavrov stated just a week or 2 weeks ago that, oh, we are welcome and please come and you can take any kid. And you know, thousands of children in Russia, in occupied territories, whose parents stay in occupied territories. They entrap. It's very hard to leave that territory. Not many people understand that you cannot pack your things and leave that territory. It's almost impossible. Even if you have a Russian passport, you could be stopped in many checkpoints and interrogated, and people are really afraid. And many families have their relatives, older people, handicapped people, and they cannot leave their whereabouts. Yeah, it's many circumstances. But if you will ask me how we can move forward, and it's only one answer, that all our allies should make a pressure on Putin to give us information first, to give us information where are these kids. If they stated that they registered hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children in Russia, what is a war crime, as they told, give us this information, give United States this information, give United Kingdom or Germany or Qatar. If Qatar provide this mediation, why they can have this information? Because, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, that's a key point for negotiators, right? I mean, we want whoever's going in to negotiate the peace to recognize that this is, well, it's a key piece under international law, and it should be a primary request as the negotiations go forward. And I feel like not everybody knows that, right? They don't understand the 4 things that the Geneva Convention requires. So we need to build awareness around what those basics are. I mean, even for people who believe that maybe Russia did take these kids out of humanitarian operation, fine, believe that, but where are the kids, right? I mean, under any circumstance, we should know
just give us information, because you know, I participated in Minsk negotiation. I can tell you a lot how negotiate with Russians. It's useless. Really,
Okay.
I know.
All right. I I don't disagree.
But it's it is about innocent kids. Just give us
Exactly.
information.
Yeah.
Give us how many. If you evacuated, give us information for that ones who've been evacuated.
Yeah.
Because for us, it's a war crime. For international legislation, it's a war crime. But
Right.
for you, because you know what is the trick? They included even territories of our region which was not invaded. You know, it's for example, all Kherson region, another region, they included to their constitution to Russia Federation. And for them, it is Russian children. They stay, then live in Ukrainian controlled territory. But for Russia, it is Russian children.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's why they violated all international legislation. But for us as Ukrainians, the main question, who will be that negotiator who will force Russia or demand or request to provide information about our children? That's all. Where are they? Because
Absolutely.
we will not be able to provide with any information about these kids before we will not be able to know where are they.
Right. Nathaniel, you have spoken in the past about the golden hour, the importance of the time and the urgency. Can you also underscore that again here? What negotiators need to keep in mind? This isn't really something that can wait a couple of years. I mean, these are children's developing minds and lives. Can you talk about the golden hour from other contexts and what it means in this?
Yeah, so in missing persons cases, we often refer in slang to this concept of the golden hour, which is from basically complex medical traumas like a car accident, where you have a patient that gets hit by a car, you have basically an hour to stabilize the situation. And when we use that term in missing persons cases like this, it means we have opportunities in the initial period after an individual is abducted to where the chance of getting the individual back is at its highest. And the more time that goes on outside of that golden hour period, the harder it is to find a missing person. And so there are some standard best practices that FBI and other law enforcement agencies use that really need to be applied here. And there's sort of four big ones to think about. The first is what's called UID, or Universal Identifier. We have the missing children's problem, the abducted children's problem in Ukraine is a data problem more than anything else. And you need that different sources of data about, say, one kid to be able to be linked to a single identification number for that kid. And so there's massive efforts going on the Ukrainian side, which we're supporting, and a lot of other actors are supporting, to get us close to that universal identification number, which helps us get the data talking to each other as soon as possible. The second best practice is basically centralization, and trying to get as much of this data and information into one coordinated source as much as possible, especially when you have multiple actors. So right now, we're in our last week of reinstated funding with the U.S. State Department and Yale Humanitarian Research Lab. We're working to transfer everything we have to Europol, our European partners, and our Ukrainian partners to try to help with that centralization effort. The other two best practices in the golden hour is really about basically flooding the zone in terms of getting as much data as possible, knowing that the data is going to disappear. And so one of the big challenges we've faced on the Yale side is the fact that as we begin to identify and publish information about the children, it can endanger the actual sources of information. And so there needs to be a lot of coordination on what data we touch, what data we say we've touched, and how we preserve, especially when we're relying on open source information, that information in the wild that could go bye-bye forever. The fourth and final point, and really something where we need to be critical about ourselves as a community, is common ethical standards for harmonizing decisions about what we show, when we show it. In the case of a U.S. Law enforcement response to a missing persons, there's a checklist of what information is released and not released at different times when you're dealing with a child kidnapping case. We have not had, across potentially as many as 35,000 children or more, we have not had standards when we've had media, governments, civil society, and intergovernmental organizations sharing data. Do you show faces? Do you show names? What does that give in terms of advantage for the perpetrator? We have not had common ethical standards. And so the golden hour has really been affected by a lack of coordination about what we show and what we don't show, which in many ways, our lack of coordination has been the single biggest advantage that we've given Russia and the perpetrators on the Russian side, due to a lack of common standards. And so really, when we look back at this response so far, we've lost that golden hour, and now we're trying to do things on year 3 that we should have done in month 1.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's such a good point. We also have commiserated on
Yeah, and can I just one remark?
Sure.
And about golden hour, when Russian soldiers with weapon come into your home and taking your kid in occupied territory to Russian army or anywhere, kidnap a kid, you have no way to inform anybody in occupied territory except Russian authorities. What is the crime? You know, you have no rights, any rights. That's why we can talk about golden hour, golden year, or golden 3 years, but they have no any rights. Thousands of hundreds of thousands of millions of Ukrainians have no rights, parents or children in occupied territory. And first of all, we have to understand how they can have access to inform someone independent, not Russia authorities, but independent organ. It could be any country independent organ, just to provide information about it.
No, that's important. I mean, I think Nathaniel was speaking about the golden hour once the child has been abducted, and you're talking about the golden hour before the child is abducted, or as the abduction is happening, which, yeah, I mean, the key would be prevention, but how do you prevent something like this in a situation like this? Lauren, you had some also important thoughts on what is at risk in terms of the global response mechanisms. Do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think I'm echoing quite a few of the other panelists and saying that kind of the key here is to depoliticize children and child protection, because that's the only way we can actually uphold humanitarian norms. And has already been flagged, we have international legal frameworks that speak to these issues. We have the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, for example, emphasizes the best interest assessments and speaks to the right of an identity. You have the Hague Convention specifying the obligation of states to cooperate with one another and promote cooperation and to secure the prompt return of children. We have the Paris Principles that define what reintegration means, etc. And all this to say that when children are not treated as rights holders first, these frameworks are undermined. And I think one of the key rights with children in these situations is that we listen to them and that we hear them. And so I'd have to say that above all, and maybe my number one key takeaway for this discussion is about the criticality of best interest assessments, which I see has also been kind of commented on in the Q&A. And I have to say, I sometimes wish that this had a more technical term, because of course we all on this panel and kind of globally want to act in the best interest of children. Why would we not? So sometimes it seems a bit obvious. But best interest assessments are not only technical child protection tools, but they serve as the cornerstone for ensuring the protection of children. And the best interests of children are determined through individual assessment. So we can't just do broad sweeps of groups of children, but we really need to understand individual children's views, their identity, their personal vulnerability, health, education, etc. And these assessments have to be credible, impartial, and conducted by child protection authorities to ensure that children have meaningful participation. And I think ultimately, if we don't make decisions on the best interests of children today, it has a lifelong impact for each one of these children that we're talking about, but also society more broadly. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is this is where the rubber hits the road, right? I mean, we know what we should do in principle, but nobody has access to these kids. So who's going to do the best interest determination? I mean, right now, there is no neutral party able to access them, unless somebody like Mikola's group manages to find some. It's so complicated. Okay, I want to move our attention to the US and the US response. The US traditionally has been a huge funder in child protection and humanitarian response. And of course, as we know, that funding is now gone. Nathaniel's work at Yale got quite a bit of press because their funding from the State Department was cut and then reinstated for a short 6 weeks just to transmit the data, but there's no follow-on grant from the US government at this point. Mykola Save Ukraine has lost $3.5 million in funding with the USAID cuts. The entire Children in Adversity team at USAID, all of the child protection specialists in the US government are now gone. But Congress still holds the power of the purse and has some influence. I want to introduce Chelsea Sobolik, who serves as the Director of Government Relations at World Relief, which is one of the largest, well, the largest evangelical humanitarian organization. And you used to work on Capitol Hill. So you understand how the US government works. And you also understand this constituency of Christians and faith leaders in America who have traditionally been exceedingly interested in anti-trafficking and protecting children from trafficking. So this is a constituency that theoretically should care about this, should engage, and you were part of pulling together a letter of faith leaders from across faith traditions to put pressure on President Trump and Secretary Rubio about this. Can you speak a little bit about that and what more can be done? Are people mobilized?
Well, thank you so much for having me and hosting this incredibly important panel discussion. As you mentioned, World Relief helped lead a faith leader letter to President Trump and Secretary Rubio on this issue. It was signed by Catholics, evangelicals, Orthodox Christians, urging the administration to prioritize the return of children as a pre-negotiation to any peace talks or ceasefire. As my colleagues on the panel have said over and over in their different seats and different hats, during times of war, it's always the most vulnerable who pay the heaviest price. And we're seeing this right now with children who are facing extraordinary vulnerabilities in the midst of this crisis and conflict. And we've seen this almost since day one of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We are coming at this from a humanitarian angle. World Relief serves in Ukraine. We primarily provide mental health services in Ukraine, but we also are coming at this from our faith. Scripture speaks very often throughout the whole Bible about what we call the quartet of the vulnerable, the emphasis on caring for the poor, for widows, for orphans, and for foreigners, those who are in unique need of protection and justice. So Christians and people of faith care about this issue, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because Scripture talks about every single one of these children who's been separated from their family, bears the image of our Creator. Another thing that scripture talks about quite a lot is the importance of family and family units and keeping family together. And we've seen tens of thousands, as my colleagues have said, likely many more of children forcibly separated from their families. And that's, as Lauren has talked about, against international law, but it is still occurring. So a couple weeks ago, at the beginning of April, we sent President Trump and Secretary Rubio a letter talking about this from the perspective of our faith, and also talking about that one of the fundamental responsibilities of government, of a good government, is to safeguard the well-being of the most vulnerable members of society. You mentioned I used to work on Capitol Hill. My boss at the time was one of the co-chairs of the Adoption Caucus, which I know my colleague James's boss leads right now. Or does a lot of work in that field, and he has for a number of years. But the Adoption Caucus is Congress's largest bipartisan bicameral caucus, and certainly they focus on adoption issues, but broader child protection issues as well. And you know, as my colleagues have said, we've seen children be subjected to forced adoptions by Russians, which again is against international law. And so this issue, I think, when I was on Capitol Hill, and James can speak to this, being on Capitol Hill now, the issue of vulnerable children is a very bipartisan issue, and I'm grateful that it has remained a pretty bipartisan issue, and it's an issue of importance to our faith. So I think, you know, I sent the letter to the administration, and actually less than a week later, myself and a number of the signers of the letter actually met with Deputy Special Envoy John Cole about this issue. We had a pretty productive conversation, and one of the things that I think everyone who signed that letter and was at that meeting is continuing to try to do is to disseminate this issue out to our different channels, so that congregate members, so that people of faith in the United States are aware that this is happening. I think one of the needles we're trying to thread is there's so many things happening at a domestic and global scale that this issue needs to break through, and people need to be aware of what's actually happening, the truths of what's happening, but that it's happening at all, and there thousands and thousands of children who are forcibly separated from their parents. And as you said, in the framing of your question, Christians traditionally have cared very deeply for vulnerable children, for children being subjected to trafficking, and we're seeing trafficking and children being subjected to extraordinary vulnerabilities at a mass scale. And so, you know, I think in closing, you know, I would say that the faith community is starting to get engaged. I think there's a lot more we can and should be doing, and I'm very proud that World Relief is helping lead those efforts. I think the last thing I'll say, as a Christian, but also being in this space, is I think this is a test of moral clarity for the global church as well. This isn't, as my colleagues have pointed out, just about Ukraine. This is really about child protection at a global scale and the future of the protection of children in conflict and crisis moving forward. And so I would urge, you know, people watching who are people of faith, that Christians can and should care about people across their borders and people experiencing vulnerabilities even when it's far from home. So again,
Thank you.
appreciate this panel.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think it's so critical when you say that, you know, faith Christians have always supported vulnerable children. It's been a bipartisan issue, which is of course true. And yet the line item for vulnerable children in the foreign assistance budget has been completely zeroed out. And that's never happened before. So, you know, in a sense, a budget is a moral document and it reflects our values. And so I think there's also a role for constituents to play in making sure that the budgets reflect our priorities, right? Because without money, it's hard to get things done.
I agree.
Yeah, thank you. So James Rice, we're going to put you on the spot as a representative in Congress, working for Senator Grassley, who's been an outspoken critic of Russia's threats and aggression. And Senator Grassley is currently also involved in an effort to ensure that this issue remains on the agenda at the top level of the U.S. government. Can you speak about how that's going and how reception is in Congress? And then also, as Congress holds the power of the purse in the United States, it's kind of up to you all to figure out how to fund these efforts and to make sure that the pipeline of assistance continues to flow. So how does that look? Thank you.
So yeah, that's right. So yes, Senator Grassley, as Chelsea mentioned, he's active on the Adoption Caucus. He's also the founding co-chair of the Foster Youth Caucus. He's done a lot of work on human trafficking. So there's there's a large interest there in the family and children, and then also Senator Grassley is a big fan of history and also has been around for a while. So he, as a young senator, he went to the Soviet Union, met with dissidents, and smuggled in Bibles. And so he, I think when we talk about some of the history here that Vladislav talked about, that's something that Senator Grassley really kind of resonates with him, and he sees what's happening and understands the historical context and understands what that means for children. I think it isn't something that gets maybe enough attention, because on Capitol Hill, a lot of the conversation is around, weapons and funding, and the issue of children isn't maybe talked about enough, and that's something Senator Grassley is working on rectifying. He did help, along with Senator Klobuchar, lead a letter to ask for a restoration of funding for the work that Nathaniel's doing, and we got the temporary extension. Obviously, Congress does have the power of the purse, and where the budget process is beginning for the next fiscal year, and so Congress will have to make those ultimate decisions about what's funded and what isn't. And so, that is something Senator Grassley is gonna engage on. And the first step, though, is kind of helping raise awareness about this issue in advance of it was talked about the Geneva Conventions and the fact that children shouldn't become bargaining chips, and so the first stage is negotiations are already sort of underway. They may begin in earnest soon. We'll see what comes of that. But it's important that the issue of the abducted children not be a bargaining chip, which that's already been mentioned, and that's something that I think we're going to be working on first and foremost, is making sure that there's a consciousness of the need to address that, but not as part of some final agreement. That should be a precondition before you end up inking a final agreement, so that the kids are not traded as like, well, we'll give back kids in return for some other concession. That would be deeply inappropriate, and we've it has already been discussed how that would set a bad precedent, and we're looking to not make things worse going forward. And so yes, that's something that I think you can expect to see more from. I'm in touch with Chelsea and her organization, and so and of course the members of Congress do take their cues from their constituents that they represent, and the faith community is a big part of that. It also resonates with a lot of members of Congress who are people of faith, and so that it is important that they hear from people back home who care about the future of the abducted children, and and of course we talk about best interest of the child, and that's something that comes up a lot in the foster care context. But in this case, in many cases, they have parents in Ukraine or close relatives, and obviously those and it's heartbreaking to think about. The parents have the ultimate. They're the they should have the say in what happens to their children, and right now they don't. They have to try to work with Nikola's group and try to, you know, the stories of these mothers that have had to try to go into Russia and rescue their kids and what they face and the obstacles they face. It's just heartbreaking. So that's something that I think resonates with a lot of Americans. Like if you think about if your child was kidnapped from your home at gunpoint and you have to try to rescue them, and you've got you know, an aggressive regime trying to hide your kid from you, that it's extraordinary. I mean, and so obviously it's something that I think resonates well on Capitol Hill. There's nobody, you don't run into opposition, you don't run into people who don't say, yes, that's something we should deal with. It's just a question of, and kind of as Chelsea was saying, just with people in the faith community, there's a lot of things going on, and it's a question of breaking through and making sure that that is on the top of mind for policymakers with all the other things going on Capitol Hill as well.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your leadership. And it was, of course, also encouraging to know that 71 out of 100 senators signed on to the bill that Graham and Blumenthal led about increasing sanctions on Russia. So that was good to see that support. In line with the power of the purse that Congress holds, I think it's important to note that Refugees International released a report that showed that less than 0.07% of the funding that went to Ukraine following Russia's full-scale invasion went directly to local actors. And we know in child protection that 90% of the work is done by communities and local organizations on the ground. So that includes, you know, Mykola Kuleba, Save Ukraine, a lot of other NGOs that we frankly don't even hear about because they're local Ukrainian organizations that are doing heroic work, often as volunteers. And Vlad Havrilov here is working with, I think, 3 of them, right? With no US government funding, as a matter of fact. So as we talk about budgets, I think it's important to understand where the money goes. That same report noted that local intermediaries are delivering programming that is 15.5% more cost efficient than international intermediaries. So, you know, the foreign aid system has been flattened in the United States, and there is talk about how it should be rebuilt and renewed and restructured. And I think we need to take this reality into consideration as we move forward and think about what we fund and how we fund, if we fund, and I hope that we will. Okay, we have about 13 minutes left. Do you want to make a round of sort of final points, especially to a US audience? I think most of the people who are listening today are a US audience. Mykola, can I start with you?
Yeah, thank you. We have these days meetings in with senators, congressmen, and you know, it's very hard to express my feelings, and I will explain you why. I am believer. I am evangelical, and United States is a strong country based on the evangelical principles or biblical principles, biblical values. And I can tell you a lot of verses from the Bible about how Christians should protect vulnerable. And Psalm 82, maybe this our meeting not for this, but I will tell this. Bible says, Psalm 82, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And for me, it is very serious for Christians about justice, about rescuing the weak and helping deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And my question is, if Christians stay on the same position, if they are ready to not only read verses, but help vulnerable, help innocent children who've been kidnapped. And my heart turned to pieces because every day I hear stories from kids, about their abduction, about how Russians threaten them, kill their parents. And my main question I'm asking myself, what can I do? If I can do more, what my brothers and sisters in United States can do, and what their actions should be, what kind of actions, because it's not enough to express concerns. It's not enough. It kills children. It's not enough now just pray. It's very important to pray, but it's not enough. What about actions? How we can save these kids? It's not enough to provide financial support. It's not enough. It's very important. But what else we can do? I tell you, we can do. I'm not telling just about American Christians or any other country. But Bible is very clear about it. And this is my message to every American Christian, just to think about it and think how I can help. Because every day we are losing thousands of children who are taken to Russian army, who are kidnapping, whose parents disappearing or killing, and we have to act. We have no time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mykola. Anybody else want to offer a closing comment? Go ahead, Vlad.
Colleagues, just want to support what Mykola said, because if we're talking about especially, for example, role of Christianity community, you know, maybe stories, Bible stories, yes, about 99 sheep, and pastor left these sheep and searching for looking one to save one. And it's about, if we're talking about our children, it's maybe it's it's small part maybe from time to time of our population, but if we don't care about this part of our population, what we have a future? And in one event, I remember we discussed about that more than 1,600,000 children in occupied territories. And if we don't care about these children, what we have a future? Where are our children? And that's why it's most important things for my mind. And it's especially about deported children, what we discussed earlier, about if we don't know about places where they situated right now, if we don't know how we could come back these children to home, what we must do.
Yeah,
And yes, it's most important things for my mind right now. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. There's some comments in the chat from a number of in the audience about what we can do collectively to ensure that this issue stays on the radar. And another asked, who are the voices that can make the difference to kind of crack through in this issue? And my feeling is it's up to us. I mean, as you were saying, as Mykola is saying, as Vlad was saying, it's up to us as citizens. If we people, whatever our faith is, if we say we care, we need to do something. We can't just wait for somebody else to do it. I mean, and that's what's so compelling about the Ukrainian response. If you see who's actually making a difference in the lives of these children, it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It's not the leading technical agencies or the organizations that receive the most funding. It's the people on the ground who care. Those are the people who make the difference. Anybody else want to offer a closing comment?
I would just
James?
say, contact your member of Congress. I mean, it really does make a difference. So however you, via their website, you can write a comment. You can set up a meeting with their staff that handle international affairs. Members of Congress really do pay attention to what the people back in their state or district have to say.
And we also got another message in the chat from Sarah, who's a great facilitator with the American Coalition for Ukraine. If you're looking for guidance about how to engage, you can follow some of those advocacy groups who are really keeping their finger on the pulse. Anyone else? Closing comment in 5 more minutes. Yeah.
I'll be brief, but I'm a mom of a 4-year-old little boy, and we celebrated Mother's Day yesterday. And we've talked a lot about geopolitics, about public policy, about what scripture says, but I think each one of us can understand the humanity of mothers and children, of fathers and children being stripped from their children, and the trauma and the heartbreak that occurs. And it's a very this issue at the end of the day is a human issue that I think each one of us can I mean, I can't begin to fathom the heartbreak, but we can get involved. And I think what you were saying just a minute ago, that faithful, ordinary people really can make a difference. So as we're wrapping up, I think I would just encourage each person to use your voice, call your member of Congress, reach out to the administration, talk about this with your friends and family, to use your network, to use your social network, your voice in whatever ways that you can to continue talking about this issue, because it really does matter, and it's going to take collective and long-term emphasis on this issue to move the needle and bring these children home.
Thank you for bringing in the mom piece. That's, of course, I mean, when you see the stories and you hear, for instance, about Vlad, who's telling his story with his mother, with members of Congress, it's really his mother's force of will that rescued him. Save Ukraine facilitated that process, but it was her grit and force of will. And you just think of what these women are doing against all odds, and surely we can drum up something to do as well. Lauren?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's an incredibly devastating topic that we've covered today. And I have to say that I look for the silver lining, and I am encouraged by the number of family reunifications that have been possible under the existing cooperation frameworks. I think the cessation of hostilities presents quite a critical opportunity. Not that we want to wait for a peace process, and we shouldn't have to wait for anything for children to be reunified. But it gives us an opportunity to step up these efforts and to bring a resolution to children and families who have suffered enough at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. So as all eyes are on the negotiations about to begin, maybe the ceasefire, please remember children at the center of this war and of the resolution of this war. And to all who are making that possible, we lift you up, we encourage you. Thank you.